They rang the bell to begin judgment, and the Apache ended it with one sentence. They rang the bell at the center of town just after sunrise, the iron sound carrying clean and sharp over the roofs and down the street, because judgment was something this place preferred to do in daylight, where everyone could see they had followed the rules. The people came as they always did, stepping out from shops and porches, gathering in a loose circle around the platform, faces already set into the expressions they wore when decisions were about to be made without appeal. A woman stood at the edge of the square, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her eyes fixed on the bell as if it might ring again and somehow change its mind, because once it sounded, there was no walking away. The sheriff took his place beside the platform, clearing his throat, waiting for the murmurs to die down. And when they did, he nodded to the man who held the ledger, because order mattered here, even when mercy did not. Names were not read yet, but everyone knew why they were present, because the town had already decided there would be a judgment before it bothered with proof. Children were pulled closer, not to protect them, but to teach them, and the woman felt the weight of that lesson settle on her shoulders as she stood alone, a shape the crowd could look at without having to look at itself. The bell's echo faded, replaced by the sound of boots shifting and breath being held, and the sheriff raised a hand to begin, his voice practiced, steady, the voice of a man used to being listened to. He spoke about order and precedent, about how the town handled matters when lines were crossed, and each word landed with the dull certainty of routine, because nothing here was new except the person it was happening to. The woman's gaze dropped to the planks beneath her feet, counting the cracks the way she used to count steps when fear pressed in, and she wondered how many times this bell had rung before for someone else, how many times the crowd had leaned in and leaned back unchanged. At the edge of the square, half in shadow, an Apache stood still, arms folded, his eyes not on the woman but on the faces around her, because he had learned long ago that judgment revealed itself best in those who believed they were safe from it. He had not come forward when the bell rang, and that absence had gone unnoticed, because the town did not look for voices it did not expect to hear. As the sheriff reached for the ledger and the moment tightened, the Apache shifted his weight slightly, just enough to mark time, because there were moments when speaking too early only fed the noise, and moments when waiting let the truth step into the open on its own. The bell had begun the judgment, and the town held its breath, unaware that the sound it was about to hear would not come from iron or authority, but from a single sentence spoken where silence had grown comfortable. The ledger opened with a dry crack that sounded too final for something that claimed to be fair, and the man holding it wet his finger before tracing the first line, because reading names made judgment feel official even when it was already decided. He cleared his throat and spoke the woman's name into the square, careful and loud, as if volume could turn rumor into fact, and the sound of it drew a murmur from the crowd that rose and fell like a practiced response. The sheriff nodded once, inviting the list to continue, and the man read charges that sounded tidy on paper, words like disorder and refusal and impropriety arranged to suggest intention where there had been none. The woman felt each word land like a weight added to her chest, and she kept her eyes forward, because looking at faces would only show her how easily they accepted what was being said. A few heads tilted, a few mouths tightened, but no one interrupted, because interruption was not part of the ritual. The bell had rung, the names were being read, and that was how things went. Children shifted at their parents' sides, learning that names could be lifted from a book and used to make a person smaller, and the woman wondered if any of them would remember this moment when they were older, or if it would blend into the many other times the town taught lessons it refused to claim. The sheriff asked if there was anything to add, and the man with the ledger shook his head because the ledger never held doubt, only conclusions. A deputy stepped forward to indicate the platform, and the woman moved because not moving would be noticed more than compliance, and as she did, the crowd leaned in, curiosity sharpening now that the story had reached its middle. At the edge of the square, the Apache shifted again, not stepping forward yet, only angling his body so he could see both the woman and the sheriff at once, because distance clarified who needed watching. The sheriff began to speak about consequence, about the importance of example, and the word example drew a ripple of agreement because examples spared people the work of thinking. The woman felt her throat tighten and swallowed, listening to her name echo again in her head, stripped of everything she knew it to be, reduced to a sound used for control. A gust of wind rattled the bell, making it clink softly, and the crowd stilled, expecting another ring, another signal to proceed, but none came, and the pause stretched long enough to feel awkward. The sheriff frowned and motioned for the man to continue, but the Apache's voice cut through first, low and even, not raised, not hurried, asking a simple question about who had been harmed and when. The square went quiet in a way it had not planned for, because the question did not fit the ledger, and the woman lifted her head for the first time, realizing that the ritual had been interrupted not by noise, but by sense, and that the names read aloud had finally reached someone who was listening. The silence that followed his question did not break right away, because the town had not practiced answering it, and the sheriff glanced toward the ledger as if it might offer help, forgetting for a moment that books only spoke when they were told. The Apache did not repeat himself. He waited, hands loose at his sides, eyes steady, letting the quiet widen until it pressed on the people who had come to watch rather than think. And in that waiting, the woman felt the strange relief of not being alone with her fear anymore. Someone near the front cleared his throat and said there had been complaints, vague ones, and the sheriff seized on that, listing them quickly as if speed could replace substance. But the Apache's gaze did not move, because he had asked about harm, not discomfort. The woman's shoulders eased a fraction, sensing that the ground beneath the ritual had softened, and she dared to look out across the faces, seeing not anger now, but uncertainty, a thinning of resolve that made people restless. The Apache stepped forward one pace, no more, careful not to climb the platform, because stepping too far would have turned him into part of the show, and he said again that he wanted to know who had been hurt, when, and how, and the way he arranged the words made it clear he expected answers that could be checked. The sheriff bristled and reminded him that the town had procedures, that judgment did not require outside approval, but the Apache answered that procedures were not proof, and the difference between them landed with a dull thud. A bell rope creaked in the breeze, and the sound drew eyes upward, because everyone expected authority to announce itself again, to rescue them from the discomfort of thinking. But the bell stayed still. The woman felt a warmth rise behind her ribs, not hope exactly, but the sense that time had slowed enough for something honest to fit inside it. A man at the back muttered that maybe this had gone too far, and another shushed him. But the shushing sounded weak now, because doubt had found a foothold. The Apache did not fill the space with argument. He let it work, because waiting exposed the gaps people hoped no one would notice. The sheriff asked if the Apache was accusing the town of wrongdoing, and the Apache replied that he was asking it to explain itself, and the difference between those two things settled heavily, because explanation required truth. The woman breathed out slowly, grounding herself, and realized that the Apache's power did not come from volume or threat, but from refusing to move until sense had somewhere to stand. As the crowd shifted and the ritual lost its rhythm, the Apache held his place, patient as stone, because sometimes the strongest interruption was not speaking at all, but waiting long enough for the noise to collapse under its own weight. The sheriff tried to reclaim the moment by leaning into habit, tapping the edge of the platform with his baton in a slow, deliberate pattern meant to reset the square, because law here had always relied on rhythm, on the steady beat of procedure that kept questions from forming. He spoke again of order, of how towns survived by repeating what worked, and each sentence landed with the practiced cadence of a sermon, familiar enough to soothe those who did not want to think too hard. The man with the ledger nodded along, turning a page even though there was nothing new to read, because motion helped sell the illusion of progress. The woman felt the old pressure return, the sense that the ritual might swallow her again if it regained its tempo, and she fixed her eyes on a knot in the wood, counting the sheriff's words the way she once counted steps to keep from panicking. The Apache watched the baton instead of the sheriff's face, noticing how the tapping grew sharper when doubt crept in, how authority hurried when it felt itself slipping, and when the sheriff paused to draw breath, the Apache spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a timing that cut cleanly through the rhythm. He said the law sounded confident when it spoke alone, but different when it was asked to answer, and the sentence fell into the space like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples that did not ask permission. The baton stopped mid-tap, and the sheriff frowned because his beat had been broken, and without it, his words lost their easy flow. A murmur rose and fell, uncertain now, and the woman felt the ground shift again. The platform no longer as solid as it had seemed. The sheriff bristled and insisted that the town had the right to judge its own, that outsiders did not dictate justice, but the Apache replied that justice dictated itself, whether a town liked the sound of it or not, and that line landed harder because it offered no enemy to argue with. Someone laughed nervously, and another told them to be quiet, because the square had changed from a place of display to a place of listening. The bell rope creaked again in the breeze, and for a moment everyone expected it to be pulled to restore the familiar order, but no hand moved, and the quiet stretched long enough to feel intentional. The woman lifted her head, realizing that the rhythm she had feared was no longer leading the moment, that the pattern of judgment had been disrupted not by force, but by a pause that refused to resolve itself. As the sheriff searched for his footing, glancing between faces that no longer reflected certainty back at him, the Apache held his ground, unhurried, because he understood that law only kept its rhythm when no one dared to interrupt it, and today, the beat had finally been broken. The square waited for something louder, something sharper, because that was what usually followed a break in rhythm, but the Apache did not raise his voice or step onto the platform, and that restraint unsettled people more than any outburst could have. He looked at the woman once, long enough to acknowledge her as a person rather than a problem, then turned back to the sheriff and spoke a single sentence, calm and measured, saying that judgment without harm was only noise, and harm had not been named here. The words did not accuse, threaten, or plead, and because of that they slid past defenses that had been built for conflict, settling instead in the open space where sense lived. The sheriff opened his mouth to respond, and found nothing arranged properly, because the sentence had not attacked the law, it had questioned its purpose, and that was harder to answer. A murmur moved through the crowd, not agreement yet, but recognition, the sound people made when something obvious was finally said out loud. The woman felt her knees weaken and steadied herself, because the sentence had shifted the weight in the square, and suddenly the platform felt less like a place of power and more like a piece of wood that could be stepped down from. The man with the ledger flipped another page and stopped, realizing there was nothing left to read that could compete with what had already been spoken, and the book closed with a soft finality that echoed louder than the bell had earlier. The sheriff tried to recover by listing procedures again, but his voice lacked conviction now, the rhythm gone, the audience changed, and people began to look at one another instead of at him, measuring their own complicity. A woman near the front whispered that she had never seen the accused harm anyone, and another nodded, adding that she had only been inconvenient, and those small truths spread quickly, because once permission was given to speak honestly, silence lost its hold. The Apache did not add another word. He remained where he was, letting the sentence do its work, because repetition would have turned it into argument, and argument would have invited defenses back into place. The woman lifted her head fully now, meeting the eyes of the crowd, and she saw something new there, not mercy yet, but restraint, the decision to stop before causing damage that could not be undone. The sheriff glanced at the bell rope once more, and then away, understanding that ringing it again would not restore control. And in that moment the town realized that the judgment they had prepared for had ended without ceremony, not because authority demanded it, but because one sentence had exposed the absence of harm at its center, leaving nothing solid left to condemn. The shift was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a tide turning far out to sea. But the woman felt it immediately as the pressure around her eased, shoulders no longer squared toward her, eyes no longer fixed with the same hungry certainty. The crowd leaned back, one step at a time, boots scraping the boards and dirt as people created space they had not known they needed until the sentence gave them permission to breathe. The sheriff sensed it too, and tried to anchor himself by clearing his throat, by straightening his coat, by doing all the small things men did when the ground beneath them stopped obeying, but none of it restored the balance he had relied on. Someone near the front lowered their gaze, embarrassed now by how eagerly they had listened earlier, and another folded their arms, not in defiance, but in self-protection, as if shielding themselves from the memory of what they had almost agreed to. The woman stood very still, afraid that moving too soon might invite the moment to snap back into place, and in that stillness, she realized how often she had been forced to shrink to survive, how unfamiliar it felt to simply remain. The Apache watched the retreat without satisfaction, because this was not victory but correction, a recalibration that should have happened before the bell ever rang. A man muttered that perhaps there had been a mistake, and another answered that perhaps there always was when judgment came before harm, and the quiet agreement between them spread without needing volume. The man with the ledger stepped down from the platform, closing the book and tucking it under his arm. And that small act signaled more than any announcement could have, because it said the ritual had ended. The sheriff opened his mouth once more, and then closed it, recognizing that any command he gave now would sound like insistence rather than authority, and insistence was no longer welcome. The woman lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in relief, and met the eyes of those nearest her, seeing not allies yet, but witnesses who would have to remember this moment whether they wanted to or not. The Apache shifted his weight and took one step back himself, careful not to remain the center of attention, because his purpose had been to stop the harm, not replace the voice of the town with his own. As the square loosened and people began to drift toward their usual paths, the bell stood silent above them all, its rope unmoving, and the woman understood that sometimes judgment ended not with a declaration, but with a crowd choosing to step back far enough to let a person remain whole. The square did not empty all at once, because people lingered when they were unsure what lesson they were meant to carry home, and the woman felt those lingering eyes on her back as she stood her ground, breathing through the aftershock of almost being decided away. The sheriff gestured for order that no longer needed enforcing, and in that slackened moment, a man near the edge spoke up, his voice hesitant, admitting that he had never seen the woman cause harm, that his complaint had been born more from irritation than fear, and the honesty of it startled even him. Another followed, saying she had helped his wife during sickness, that she had always paid her way, and the truth spread carefully, one sentence at a time, because courage traveled slower when it did not wear a uniform. The Apache did not add to it. He stood apart, hands resting loosely at his sides, understanding that truth spoken once opened a door others had to choose to walk through on their own. The woman listened, heart steadying, as the shape of her life was spoken back to her by people who had never bothered to say these things when they might have mattered sooner, and she held that contradiction without comment, because this moment was not about collecting apologies. The sheriff's face tightened as the narrative slipped beyond his control, and he tried to redirect by asking for final statements. But the man with the ledger shook his head, saying there was nothing left to record because nothing actionable had been proven. The bell rope stirred slightly in the breeze, a reminder of how close it had come to being pulled again, and the woman felt a shiver pass through her that had nothing to do with cold. The Apache spoke once more, quieter than before, saying that truth did not need repetition to hold, and that sentence carried the same calm weight as the first, reinforcing rather than expanding, and the crowd accepted it without protest. A few people nodded, not to him but to each other, as if making a private agreement about how they would remember this day. The sheriff exhaled and announced that the matter was concluded, his words stripped of triumph, and as the square finally began to thin in earnest, the woman realized that what had saved her was not spectacle or sympathy, but the simple fact that harm had been named as absent and once named could not be manufactured again. She stepped down from the platform on her own, feet steady, and the Apache shifted aside to let her pass, not escorting her, not claiming the moment because his work had been to speak once and then trust the truth to stand without him. Silence settled over the square in a way that felt deliberate rather than empty, the kind that followed when words had finally finished their work and no one wanted to be the first to disturb what had been repaired. The woman walked a few steps away from the platform and stopped, uncertain how to move through a town that had almost judged her away, and the quiet around her made space for thoughts she had kept buried during the noise. She realized that silence had done what shouting never could. It had forced people to sit with the absence of harm, to feel how flimsy their certainty had been, and that discomfort lingered like a bruise. The sheriff remained near the platform, hands resting on the railing, not speaking, because any attempt to explain would have sounded like defense, and defense would have reopened questions no one wanted asked again. The man with the ledger lingered too, thumbing the edge of the closed book as if to reassure himself that it would stay shut, and the bell rope hung motionless above them all, a visible reminder of restraint. A few townsfolk approached the woman quietly, offering small acknowledgments rather than apologies, a nod, a soft word, a look that said they would remember this when memory was inconvenient, and she accepted them without comment, because silence did not require forgiveness to be effective. The Apache stood off to the side, half turned away, giving the moment room to belong to the town rather than to him, and in that distance the woman understood that his intervention had not replaced one authority with another. It had removed the need for authority entirely. Children drifted closer, curiosity replacing fear, and the woman met their eyes calmly, aware that what they learned here would shape how they saw judgment in the years to come. The square began to loosen as people resumed small movements, conversations starting again in careful tones, as if afraid to break something newly set, and the woman felt her shoulders lower, tension draining with each ordinary sound. She noticed then how silence had marked the end more clearly than any declaration could have, because it left no room for triumph or blame, only the quiet work of adjustment. The Apache finally moved, stepping back toward the edge of town, and though no one stopped him, several watched until he disappeared from view because they understood that his absence was part of what had been given to them. The responsibility to carry the moment forward on their own. As the bell tower cast its long shadow across the square, the woman stood in the stillness a moment longer, feeling the weight of what had not happened, and she knew that silence had ended the judgment more completely than the bell ever could, by leaving nothing left to argue with. No one clapped, no one raised a hand, and no sound rose to mark the end of what had nearly become a spectacle, because applause would have felt like stealing credit for restraint that should have existed all along. The woman stood near the edge of the square, feeling the weight of eyes that no longer judged but still remembered, and memory was heavier than accusation because it stayed. The sheriff spoke briefly, his voice measured and unadorned, saying the matter was closed and no further action would be taken, and the lack of ceremony in his words made it clear that authority had learned not to linger. A few people nodded, others looked down, and the man with the ledger tucked it beneath his arm, as if it were something that might burn if left open too long. The Apache remained where he was, not stepping forward to accept acknowledgement, because the moment did not belong to him, and that refusal to claim it stripped the square of any chance to turn restraint into theater. The woman felt a strange steadiness settle in her chest, not relief exactly, but the quiet strength of having remained intact in a place designed to reduce her, and she held that feeling without display. Someone murmured that it was for the best. Another answered that it never should have come to this, and the exchange ended there because agreement did not need elaboration. Children drifted away first, interest fading once there was nothing dramatic left to watch, and their parents followed more slowly, carrying private reckonings that would not be spoken out loud. The sheriff stepped down from the platform and walked off without looking back, his coat unbuttoned now, posture less rigid, and the square seemed to exhale with his departure. The woman turned toward her own path, aware that no one would stop her, and the knowledge felt heavier than freedom, because it came with responsibility, the obligation to live visibly in a town that had almost erased her. The Apache shifted then, moving toward the road, and though a few eyes followed him, no one called out, understanding perhaps that silence was the final acknowledgement this moment required. As the square emptied and ordinary noise returned in careful fragments, the woman realized that judgment without cheers was the only kind that left nothing to undo later, no pride to defend, no victory to protect. Only the simple fact that harm had been avoided and that sometimes the truest ending was one no one felt entitled to celebrate. The bell never rang again that day, and its silence followed the woman as she walked away from the square, a quiet weight that felt heavier than the iron sound ever had, because it marked a moment the town would not be able to deny later. She moved through familiar streets that now felt altered, not softened, not kinder, but aware. And that awareness clung to doorways and windows as people watched her pass without speaking, knowing words would cheapen what restraint had accomplished. At the edge of town, the Apache paused where the road dipped toward open land, adjusting the strap of his pack, ready to leave without ceremony, because endings that asked for attention were often dishonest. The woman stopped a short distance away, uncertain how to acknowledge what had happened without turning it into something smaller. And in that pause, she understood that gratitude did not always need to be spoken to be real. The Apache met her eyes briefly and inclined his head, not as a bow, but as recognition, and told her that silence had held because it was true, and that truth did not require a witness to remain standing. She nodded once, accepting the words as they were meant, and turned back toward her home, carrying with her not a debt but a steadiness she had not known she could claim. Behind her, the town resumed its rhythms slowly, cautious at first, as if afraid the bell might contradict them, and when it did not, life continued with a subtle shift, the knowledge that judgment could be interrupted if someone chose to speak carefully enough. The Apache walked on, leaving the town smaller in his wake, not diminished, but exposed, and the woman realized that what had been given to her was not protection, but space, the room to exist without being measured aloud. As the sun moved across the sky and shadows lengthened, the bell tower stood silent against the blue, no longer a promise of order, but a reminder of restraint, and the woman felt the weight of that reminder settle into memory. She reached her door and paused before going inside, listening to the ordinary sounds of the town, carts, voices, footsteps, and she understood that nothing dramatic had changed, and yet everything had, because when the bell went quiet, the power it held was broken, replaced not by another authority, but by the simple, enduring fact that harm had not been named and therefore could not rule. No speech followed, no victory was claimed. One sentence was enough to expose how empty judgment becomes when harm cannot be named. In that quiet, a woman remained whole, and a town was forced to listen to its own silence.